diplomatic team is in the region, but wouldn't comment further.
I can confirm that a small British diplomatic team is in Benghazi. We are in touch with them, but it would be inappropriate for me to comment further on that for reasons I'm quite sure you understand.
But with thousands of foreign workers fleeing the fighting in Libya, aid groups are struggling to deal with the sheer numbers crossing the border, or at least trying to. We'll be speaking to the UN Refugee Agency at the Tunisian-Libyan border a little later in the programme. Now, protests are continuing in the island kingdom of Bahrain. A large crowd has gathered outside the Prime Minister's office. There's a heavy police presence inside the gates of the palace, and demonstrators, mainly from the Shia Muslim majority, remain camped out at the Pearl roundabout in the capital, Manama. Our special correspondent joins us now on the line from the Bahrain capital. We're not naming him for security reasons. So how large were these demonstrations today compared to ones we've seen in the past?
Well, Jim, they were certainly large demonstrations. Protesters gathered at the three entrances to this palace, which also serves as the Prime Minister's official office. There were many thousands of protesters. They weren't on the same kind of scale that we've seen on Friday and Saturday, where tens of thousands of Bahrainis took to the streets and brought traffic to a standstill. These were quite localised. They've now dispersed, and the focus of their rally has now moved. In fact, as I speak, they're starting to gather at Pearl roundabout, where the protesters have been camped out for nearly 3 weeks now. The protests have been peaceful. There's been no sign of any kind of confrontation with the security forces, largely perhaps because the security forces have been ordered to avoid any bloodshed. That was after 7 protesters were killed in February, after the first demonstrations on February the 14th. In fact, President Obama communicated and talked to King Hamad here and made clear that the US certainly didn't want to see any kind of repetition of those deaths. And the government have been emphasising that they've launched an investigation into what happened and that it won't happen again. But the deaths have served as a rallying cry for the protesters, and they say they won't let up until they get all of their demands, Adrian.
Just remind us once again what the protesters' main demands are and whether the government's made any concessions to them.
Well, there are a whole range of demands. I think the first one, the most basic, is that they want a new government. They want all of the current government to be sacked. They want to see a completely new government. They also want to see work started on a new constitution, because they say that although on paper Bahrain does have a constitutional monarchy, in fact the real power lies in the hands of the royal family. Many of the ministers are members of the royal family. There's a lot of power in the hands of King Hamad, and that Parliament really is a weak body in their eyes. Some of the protesters are also calling for the fall of the royal house itself, and they're saying one of their chants is down Khalifa, which is the ruling family here. Now, some of the opposition politicians have stepped back from that, and they're saying that they're willing to talk about a constitutional monarchy, but nobody knows exactly when that might happen, and whether, in fact, they're going to demand certain conditions. Some of them have been saying if we're not already guaranteed a new cabinet, for example, then we're not going to talk to the government, Adrian.
OK, many thanks indeed. That's our special correspondent there reporting live from Bahrain. Now, in Yemen, at least 40 pro-democracy protesters have been wounded in clashes with government loyalists. The fighting happened in Ib city, which is south of the capital, Sana'a. Witnesses said that they heard gunfire and saw government supporters wielding batons and throwing stones. The protesters have been gathered in the city for more than a week. Meanwhile, the US has warned its citizens against travelling to Yemen. It says the security threat is extremely high there due to what it calls terrorist activities and civil unrest. AlJazeera's Kimberly Halkett reports.
As thousands of anti-government protesters continue to rally in Yemen, in Washington, lawmakers meet to discuss what they say is now America's most urgent national security threat.
The ramifications are all going to be very real as we look at the changing nature of what's going on in Yemen, a protected stronghold for al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula.
The al-Qaeda group has been on Washington's radar for some time. It's suspected of waging a campaign to radicalize U.S. citizens, even inspiring Nadel Hassan, the man charged with killing 13 people at a U.S. Army base in Texas. So last month, the Pentagon doubled its military assistance to the Yemen government to fight al-Qaeda. But mounting anti-government protests in Yemen are making Washington nervous about its allies' future. What happens if the government falls? It's a question AlJazeera put to the U.S. State Department.
Yes, Yemen is a very important country to the United States.
So what impact does this unrest have on that security concern?
Well, they're not mutually, they're not mutually exclusive. In other words, there is a genuine security concern in Yemen that is a concern for Yemen and for the United States.
This intelligence analyst says containing al-Qaeda in the event of a power vacuum is a problem the Obama administration has few solutions for.
There was a real decision point in the administration what they were going to do, and the calculation didn't come down on our interests. It came down on what can we really do. We can't stop them. We don't have the resources to do it.
But members of the Yemeni American community argue the al-Qaeda threat in Yemen is overstated. If the government collapses, they say al-Qaeda would have little support.
Al-Qaeda has no base with the Yemeni people. Al-Qaeda is hated in Yemen.
Despite the challenges of the Yemen protests, Washington's hopeful any imminent threats can still be contained. Kimberly Halkett, Al Jazeera, Washington.
As we've been reporting here on Al Jazeera, Saudi Arabia has banned all demonstrations after a series of minor protests in the oil-producing eastern province. Just to remind you, mainly Shia demonstrators gathered in the towns of Qatif and Hafuf on Thursday and Friday. They've been demanding the release of all prisoners being held without trial, as well as better access to jobs. Some rare videos just been published online of those protests in Qatif. It appears to show heavily armed police confronting protesters chanting anti-government slogans. The video is linked online to the March 11th Facebook campaign, which calls for a day of protests against the ruling Al Saud family. Meanwhile, Oman's Sultan Qaboos has replaced 3 of his cabinet ministers after days of violent unrest. Protesters have been calling for more jobs and better political representation there. Workers have been staging a sit-in at the main oil field in Haima to demand more investment from the state. Let's get more on the flashpoints throughout the Arab world right now by speaking with Sultan Saud Al-Qasemi, who's a columnist for The National and joins us now live from Dubai. Thank you for being with us. So before we talk about what's going on right now in Bahrain and Oman, let's widen it out. Do you think the other Gulf states, the UAE, Qatar, are bracing themselves for possible protests?
Certainly the Gulf does not live in isolation from what's happening in the rest of the Arab world. In fact, we do know that this year the UAE is expected to have some sort of elections